thank you so much for inviting me. This is my first Pint of Science, and I'm really excited to talk to you about educational success and specifically what matters for educational success beyond intelligence and why. So several factors contribute to explaining why students differ from each other in academic achievement, and these factors include the home, the school, the neighborhood environment, the prenatal environment they're exposed to, their healthy physical development, motivations, intelligence, for example. However, one source of differences between students that is very rarely considered in models of education is genetics. And today, I will present evidence for how genetic differences between people contribute to their observed differences in learning. So even when genetic factors are taken into account, which is rarely, it is often assumed that genetic factors would contribute to academic achievement through cognitive ability, which is also called intelligence, and which at its core is the ability to plan, reason, and think abstract. So it is often assumed that academic achievement is partly heritable because cognitive ability is heritable. But here, I will present evidence for the contribution of genetic factors to academic achievement beyond intelligence, and I really will start to identify which are those factors that contribute to the genetics of academic achievement beyond intelligence. And finally, I will discuss how we can start thinking about a comprehensive evidence-based model of education that integrates these genetic discoveries. So, evidence for how genetic differences between people contribute to their differences in behavior and psychological traits first emerged from family studies and specifically twin studies. So twin research capitalizes on the genetic relatedness between identical twins who share 100% of their genes and fraternal twins who share on average 50% of the genes that differ between individuals like any other pair of siblings. And by comparing how similar identical and fraternal twins are for a trait, it is possible to calculate the extent to which differences between people in that trait are due to genetic and environmental factors. And twin studies allow to identify three key influences. Genetics, or A, called in our complicated ACE models, shared environmental influences, or C, which are the environmental factors that make children growing up in the same family more similar to one another, for example, shared parenting. And non-shared environmental factors, or E, which are the environmental factors that don't contribute to similarity between siblings, such as, for example, different peer groups or different friendships. So how heritable is academic achievement? And what I mean by that is, to what extent do genetic differences between students contribute to their observed differences in academic achievement? In this twin study, conducted in a very large sample of twins from England and Wales, we found that academic achievement is substantially heritable, about 60%, at every stage of compulsory education, from age 7, so key stage 1, to age 16, measured at GCSE, as it's indicated by the red portion of these bars. Interestingly, in this study, we also found that academic achievement is highly stable over development, and we found that on average, 80% of this stability was explained by genetic factors. But this is not all that we found. Once we statistically removed intelligence from the equation, we found that academic achievement remains substantially heritable, stable, and its stability mostly accounted for by genetic factors, which indicates that a substantial portion of differences between students in academic achievement and in its heritability is not explained by intelligence. And this is really not a new idea. And in fact, as Dostoevsky famously wrote in Crime and Punishment, it takes something more than intelligence to act intelligently. However, what is this something more that makes us act intelligently? And we explored this question in this study conducted in another twin sample of children from Austin, Texas. And we focused on answering one key question, which is what matters for academic achievement beyond cognitive ability and why? And here we'll present results focusing on reading ability. So this bar chart shows the proportion of reading ability that is accounted for by genetic, or A, shared environmental, or C, and non-shared environmental factors, or E. And if we focus on the bar on the left, which indicates the extent of the genetic contribution to reading ability in childhood, first of all, we see the genetic factors explain about 75% of the differences between children in reading ability. So reading is substantially heritable. But so now let's focus on the red, purple, and blue portions of the bar. And these indicate that about 55% of these differences are explained by different types of cognitive ability, for example, fluid intelligence or executive functions. But in light blue, the light blue and the green portions of the bar show how much of other factors contribute to the genetics of reading ability after statistically removing the role of intelligence. And these are personality and motivational factors, which are also called non-cognitive skills. And non-cognitive is really an imperfect term to describe those skills that differ from what has traditionally been education's primary focus, so academic and cognitive performance. And the umbrella of non-cognitive skills includes a very wide range of competencies, such as academic motivation, perseverance, mindset, learning strategies, and social skills. And here, we examined the role played by many non-cognitive skills. And we found that non-cognitive skills related to how open to experiences students are, for example, how interested, curious, confident, and creative students are, all matter for reading ability beyond intelligence. And in fact, these skills mattered more than diligence, perseverance, and conscientiousness. And the fundamental part of this work was to explore why these non-cognitive skills were associated with reading ability. So do they relate to reading ability largely for genetic or environmental reasons? And we found strong genetic links between non-cognitive skills and academic achievement beyond intelligence. Therefore, non-cognitive skills such as interest, curiosity, self-confidence in learning all matter for academic achievement beyond intelligence, and partly because there is a shared genetic predisposition towards both academic achievement and non-cognitive skills. However, twin studies don't really allow us to identify the specific molecular basis and to identify where in the DNA this genetic predisposition lies. And in order to identify specific genes, we need to conduct gene discovery studies called genome-wide association studies, or GWAS. And GWAS aim to uncover how differences between individuals at several places in the DNA relate to differences in their traits, from height, for example, to personality to cognitive ability. And these places in the DNA are called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. And one of the largest and most successful gene discovery studies in the behavioral sciences looked at educational attainment and uncovered over 1,200 places in the DNA, called SNPs, that are significantly associated with how far people go in education. And all the SNPs uncovered by the study are shown here in this figure, in the figure shown here on the right, which shows the chromosomes on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, how significant each association is. And all the dots above the black dotted line are the loci, so the places in the DNA that are associated with variation in educational attainment after accounting for hundreds of thousands of tests. So the take-home message here is that there is not one or a few genetic variants associated with how far people go in education, but it is many genes, so each of very small effect. So given our previous findings on how genetic differences between people matter for non-cognitive skills, and for how these relate to academic achievement, we really wanted to conduct a gene discovery study and pinpoint the genetic variants associated with differences between individuals in non-cognitive skills. However, we were faced with a number of challenges, and the core challenge being that data on non-cognitive skills, unfortunately, are not often collected as part of large biobanks. But ultimately, we realized that a way of overcoming these challenges started with the definition of non-cognitive skills themselves. So if we were willing to embrace a popular, yet imperfect, definition of non-cognitive skills as all the contributions to educational attainment that are not cognitive skills, then we could find a way around the challenges, and we could leverage information from existing gene discovery studies to obtain a GWAS of non-cognitive skills. And so we took two existing powerful gene discovery studies, the one of educational attainment, which I described before, and the gene discovery study of cognitive performance, to derive a GWAS of non-cognitive skills. So specifically, what we did was to subtract the genetic variants associated with cognitive performance, shown here in blue, from the genetic variants associated with educational attainment, to identify genetic variants associated with education beyond cognitive ability, so associated with non-cognitive skills. And we call this method a GWAS by subtraction. So thanks to the GWAS by subtraction, we can finally pinpoint several loci in the DNA. Here we identified 157, but really this is like to be just the tip of the iceberg. But so 157 places in the DNA associated with differences between people in non-cognitive skills related to education. However, as we saw before, these are many, many genetic variants of very small effect. So each of these individually, it's unlikely to help us identify how these genetic differences in non-cognitive skills relate to differences in behavior. However, an exciting application is that we can now take findings from gene discovery studies and aggregate information from many SNPs, so many places in the DNA, across the genome, into a single composite index called the polygenic score. And a polygenic score can be calculated in relatively small samples and provides an index, although partial, of genetic influence on specific traits, in this case, non-cognitive skills. And we constructed polygenic scores for cognitive and non-cognitive skills and examined how each of these polygenic scores predicted differences between people in education-related traits. So if we focus on the red box here, you can see the prediction of adult educational attainment. And as you can see, the two curves, the blue and the orange curve, completely overlap, which indicates that the genetics of cognitive and non-cognitive skills are equally important in predicting how far people go in education. So we also wanted to see to what extent the genetics of non-cognitive skills contributed to academic achievement beyond the genetic of cognitive skills at every stage in that. And here you can see the extent of the contribution indicated by the orange dots and the contribution of cognitive genetics indicated by the blue dots. And as you can see, non-cognitive genetics contribute substantially to variation in achievement at all developmental stages. But not only that. Here we can see that while the role of cognitive genetics remains fairly stable, the role of non-cognitive genetics increases over development. And this is a finding that has been found in several other studies, which have found that polygenic prediction of academic achievement increases over development. But here, we can start to provide preliminary evidence to why that seems to be driving, what seems to be driving this increase. Not cognitive ability, but in fact, non-cognitive skills. This, however, might be counterintuitive. So we know that DNA does not change at birth, but genetic prediction increases over development. How can this be? So evidence of increased heritability and genetic prediction over development are consistent with the existence of gene-environment correlation processes, which is really that exposure to the environment does not happen at random, but is in part correlated with genetic disposition. And as children grow up and they're more and more able and inclined to shape their environmental experiences, they do so based in part on their genetic propensity. And this is likely to result in increased polygenic prediction over development. And here, we provide a potential explanation of how this shaping environmental experience related to education based on genetic propensity might happen. So this seems to be happening through non-cognitive, motivational, and affective processes, rather than solely cognitive ones. So research overall points to the great benefits that come from considering both cognitive and non-cognitive skills in conjunction in order to predict life outcomes such as educational and professional success. However, in addition, of course, to being partly rooted in genetic variation, these associations are also shaped by the social context and the environment, of course. and by a complex interplay between genes and environment. So students are likely to actively seek out and receive enriched environments, partly based on genetic influences. And I think that our educational system and practice should be more sensitive to this complex interplay between genetic and environmental factors. So to answer the burning question for tonight, what matters for educational success and why? So we now have ample evidence to show that academic achievement is substantially heritable and stable beyond intelligence, and that non-cognitive skills such as openness to new experiences, curiosity, confidence in one's learning, creativity, all matter, and in part they do so via genetic mechanisms. So we can now pinpoint many loci in the DNA that are associated with differences between people in non-cognitive skills, each of very small effect. And non-cognitive genetics matter for achievement throughout compulsory education, and really their role becomes increasingly important over development, which likely reflects the complex interplay and the complex correlation between genes and environmental influence. And the genetic discoveries are really a first step to provide a platform to investigate biological and environmental mechanisms. So I would argue that it is time to integrate non-cognitive skills in educational practice, shifting the focus away from the current solely performance-oriented culture towards a broader, holistic conceptualization of children and adolescents as learners. And I would also argue that a successful integration of non-cognitive skills into educational practice would consider both genetic and environmental factors and the complex interplay. And with this, of course, I have many people to thank, particularly my wonderful mentors and all my collaborators, co-authors and colleagues and students. And of course, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Margherita. And this is the last chance for you guys in the audience to leave some comments or questions, so please do so. But Margherita, thank you. That was such a great talk. There's so many different aspects of shaping academic success. It seems always just reduced to the IQ, so thank you for highlighting some of the other aspects as well. Actually, I have one very quick question. So obviously academic success is somewhat related to, I guess, success overall in the workplace. Are there similar connections, or is this beyond your area?
No, yes, they are. So, and in fact, non-cognitive skills are a very good predictor of professional success as well as academic success. And of course, academic success is related to professional success. So, how well you do in school is a very good indicator of how well you might do professionally. And we know that how well you do in school is not really shaped only by your cognitive ability, but also by all of these personality, motivation-related characteristics, which unfortunately are mostly overlooked by our educational system. So our education increases our cognitive ability, but we don't really focus very much on the non-cognitive side of learning, which I think potentially should be more integrated in our educational system.
Yeah, certainly sounds like it. We should definitely do that. But now some questions from the audience. So Andrina is asking, what about the inclusion of emotional intelligence, sometimes seen as opposing skill to standard intelligence?
Yes. So absolutely. So and this is really why non-cognitive skills is a very imperfect term. So it seems like a catch-all phrase, but it really is a big umbrella term that includes several skills, and one of these is social skills, which I think is closely related to emotional intelligence. But absolutely, I think that's incredibly important to highlight, and it would be incredibly important to really start thinking about how we can integrate these in the curriculum, so how we can teach these skills as well as teaching all the cognitive and academically and knowledge-oriented skills.
Yeah, true. Next question from Loic. Does it mean that mutations could affect our cognitive or non-cognitive skills?
If you mean by mutation, you mean genetic variation, absolutely. And that's exactly what I showed you. So in the orange plot. It's called the Manhattan plot. So those are all the places in the DNA that we identify where differences between people relate to their differences in non-cognitive skills. So yes, genetic differences. So if by mutation you mean differences, absolutely, genetic differences between people affect how different we are in our expression of non-cognitive skills. Of course, only partly, and of course, the main message is also that our genes don't really work in a vacuum, so they always operate within an environment. So particularly for a trait like education, that is completely environmentally contingent. So if we are not taught how to read, we won't show any reading ability, although we might have a good genetic predisposition for it.
Yeah.
So
thank you. Next question from Julia. Do you see any differences when twins are the same sex or the opposite sex?
Therefore, dizygotic twins. So in terms of correlation, the opposite sex twins seem to be less similar to each other in terms of performance than the same sex twins. However, if you consider sex differences, for example, we know that in cognitive ability, and particularly the non-verbal aspect of cognitive ability, there are some sex differences, particularly in spatial ability. Although these are not huge at all, but at the level of academic achievement, we don't really find many significant sex differences. The performance is equal for males and females at the level of the distribution.
Yeah, of course, yeah. I think we have a last question from Claire. So should we be addressing fear of failure from early childhood?
Absolutely, yes. And in fact, I did my PhD on academic anxiety, and I would say absolutely yes. And we know now that, for example, even the way anxiety affects performance is partly based on this non-cognitive skills, partly based on motivation. So in a paper that we published a couple of years ago with some colleagues in the mouse sample, so the Italian sample of children, we found that academic anxiety, mathematics anxiety specifically, tends to be negatively related with mathematics performance. However, this relationship varies at different levels of motivation. So the relationship between anxiety and performance is negative when children are not motivated. But when children are highly motivated, the relationship between anxiety and achievement actually is positive. And these children are, and this seems to be happening through how much time these more anxious children spend in learning mathematics. So absolutely, we really should be addressing fear of failure from early on, and particularly in this highly test-oriented culture that seems to be taking away a bit the joy of learning from the classroom, and seems to be making children quite fearful of the outcome more than joyful about learning. So I think that tests are incredibly helpful, but potentially too high stake in this country.
Yeah, I have one quick question for that. So, do you think like approaches like Montessori, for example, are far better for academic success, or just learning these other skills?
Actually, for every parent chooses the best for their children, right? And so I think that it's a lot of parents do choose this, to follow one or another approach. However, I don't think that there is much evidence to support that the Montessori approach actually leads to greater benefit than any other approach. So there isn't actually much evidence. But it's education, and it's not all about outcome. It's also about the journey. It's about how you feel while learning, and if that's the right process towards which you enjoy learning, absolutely great. Although there isn't plenty of evidence to show that leads to a greater performance, but as I said, performance is only one indicator of an educational experience.
For sure. Thank you, Margherita, for your talk and obviously facilitating this discussion. And with
Thank you, Maya.
You're welcome. And with that, our Pint of Science Night draws to an end. Again,